Well, good afternoon. I first of all want to welcome TTC Chair Jaye Robinson, who is joining us virtually for the press conference today. I guess she's somewhere to be found, or she's supposed to be on the screen next to me when it's her turn to speak. But I want to welcome her in particular, of course, because no one stands next to anybody, it seems, these days for these kinds of public occasions. But while she's been welcomed back to City Council, where we were just delighted to have her back, I should say that this is the first thing I've done with her in her particular capacity as TTC Chair. And she was never really gone, notwithstanding battling some health issues. She was present throughout, and her hand was there and her voice was heard, but she's back now, and I just think that's great for transit riders, and it's great for the TTC, and it's great for us at City Council, so a welcome to her. So the TTC's 2021 budget has been released today, and it goes to the Commission for consideration next week. The budget preserves priority service, making sure that we have more buses on the routes where they are most needed and with no fare increase that is in the budget for this coming year. In the wake of the unprecedented pandemic, which has hit our TTC extremely hard, this is the right and the responsible thing to do. We're keeping the TTC affordable for residents who need it by freezing fares, and that's not to mention some of the initiatives we're undertaking as a city to provide for lower income groups and the continuation of the kids 12 and under riding for free on the TTC. But all of this taken together, including the fare freeze for 21, is the right thing to do, given the economic impact of COVID-19 on people, aside from the impact it's had on business and on the TTC. And it is one more way in which we can help the residents of the City of Toronto get through this crisis. We are putting service, especially in the case of many of the routes that are providing more service than before COVID-19, we are putting the service exactly where we know ridership remains in need of that higher ridership. The $2.15 billion operating budget for the TTC and Wheel-Trans is made possible by maintaining the city's $789.8 million subsidy, and is helped by the Safe Restart funding secured this year and provided by the two governments, the provincial and the federal governments, announced yesterday between myself and Minister Stephen Clark. This budget anticipates additional pandemic-related costs of $796.4 million. These costs will partly be funded by Safe Restart funding from the federal and provincial governments and by their expected ongoing support in 2021. It is taking all three governments, municipal, provincial, and federal, to help the TTC, which is by far Canada's largest transit system, to get through this crisis and to ensure that it will be a strong and reliable transit service during the pandemic recovery. I want to again thank Minister Clark, Minister Phillips, the Finance Minister for Ontario, and Premier Doug Ford, along with Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and Prime Minister Trudeau, for their commitment, which I can assure you has been real, and it has been there throughout the discussions we've had about the particular difficulties facing Toronto's huge transit system. I want to thank them for providing this emergency support and for meeting this challenge with unprecedented cooperation. I also want to specifically thank Transportation Minister Caroline Mulroney for her commitment to public transit and for her continuously working with us to make sure that the TTC continues to operate, to get all of our frontline heroes, and that includes the people who work at the TTC, to get them all to work and to get those who need to be going to school or to work to and from work in all different places, school and work and various other places, and to do so safely throughout what has been a much longer pandemic than perhaps any of us expected. $776 million of the $1.205 billion for the City of Toronto announced yesterday for the city was for transit. And it demonstrates that Minister Mulroney and her department have gone to work for us, and that she herself is a good and reliable ally for the City of Toronto and for the TTC at Queen's Park. I also want to thank Infrastructure Minister Catherine McKenna at the federal level, who has been a tenacious ally for our city, for public transit generally on Parliament Hill, and for continued investment going forward in public transit infrastructure. I was extremely encouraged to hear Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister McKenna say earlier this month that they will be bringing forward a plan in January for permanent federal transit funding from the Government of Canada. This is something that is much needed and will be much welcomed, and it will help us with the much more needed transit for the City of Toronto and for the GTA, and ensure that we are investing in subway trains, in streetcars, in buses as we go forward. The TTC budget makes it clear, however, that we as a city aren't waiting to make investments in TTC vehicles. We're not waiting for this permanent funding or for commitments from others as much as they're needed to make the complete purchase we need to make. The 2021 staff recommended TTC capital budget of almost $1.32 billion will provide for 300 new buses, 70 Wheel-Trans buses, 13 streetcars, and begins the work. It only begins, but it makes a substantial beginning on the work that we have to do on new subway trains for Line 2 and to add capacity for Line 1. We can, and I am confident we will, do more with the anticipated support of the other governments, but thanks to the existence of the city building levy, we're able to move forward with an initial purchase, which we will do. And I can assure you in my discussions with the other governments that the existence of the city building levy, our ability to say our money is in and that we're putting it on the table to help make these purchases, is very helpful to us in terms of our own legitimacy in making those very reasonable requests. 60% of the capital budget is going towards the state of good repair, the upgrades and the modernization work that we need to do in order to keep our transit system operating well and safely. This budget also continues the work we have done with the TTC and the city on an enhanced set of targeted COVID-19 measures to help our most vulnerable residents during lockdown periods. We've been working with the TTC to make sure that in hotspot neighborhoods we are adding extra buses to achieve greater physical distancing to the maximum extent possible on the busier routes. We know this distancing won't always be possible at the busiest times. That is why we brought in a mandatory mask rule for the TTC. But we're working to get as many buses as possible on the busiest bus routes in the areas hardest hit by COVID. That is also why we brought back every TTC worker we could this fall, despite the fact that ridership remains at unprecedented lows and likely will continue to be at lows through large parts of 2021. This budget will fund that ongoing work and continue to ramp up services where needed in the new year. This involves reallocation of resources from lower ridership bus routes in less busy periods, such as routes, for example, that serve the downtown-centered office travel patterns, to busier routes with higher ridership demand, such as the 35 Jane and 54 Lawrence East. To further reduce crowding for customers, the TTC restored express bus service on busy corridors like on Jane Street and on Lawrence Avenue East. The TTC's service plan, which was approved this week along with this budget, will make sure that the TTC will continue to restore express bus service to add more capacity and to reduce crowding for customers. The first phase of service restoration will begin in January, when express bus service will be restored on more corridors, including Finch, Keele, and Don Mills Road. Beyond January, this budget makes sure the TTC can focus on optimizing capacity by balancing service levels across the city to ensure that capacity matches demand and customer crowding is minimized, so the service will be provided where it is needed the most. Over the next 2 months, the TTC will continue retraining subway and streetcar operators to drive buses, so that we can have even more buses with drivers, obviously, on the road in the new year. When the pandemic began, there was a real danger that the catastrophic drop in TTC ridership would force a significant reduction in service and an equally significant increase in fares. Today, we have a proposed TTC 21 budget that protects the service that we know riders need and freezes fares so that transit doesn't cost more for the people who need it every single day. This is thanks to the TTC's hard work, and it was an across-the-board effort of a very dedicated staff and with a very dedicated leader, that being the CEO of the TTC, Rick Leary, and a very dedicated chair who works hand in hand as a partner with the CEO and with the board to get these things done. And I want to thank them very much for what they did in terms of bringing about substantial cost containment so that we could continue with what is a huge contribution that the city makes. It's up 46% since I became there to the multiple hundreds of millions of dollars specified earlier, almost $800 million, and that support will continue. But without the efforts of the leadership of the Commission and their efforts on things like cost containment, we wouldn't have been able to freeze fares and keep service going at the same time. I would also be remiss if I did not extend my thanks to our frontline TTC workers, who are among the heroes that have helped us get through this pandemic. Those heroes on the TTC take some of the other heroes, whether it's in grocery retail or whether it's in the healthcare system or in long-term care, to work and home safely each and every day. And they have my profound and sincere thanks for that role that they have played. And I want to once again say thank you to our federal and provincial partners. Everybody from the Premier and the Prime Minister through the ministers and some of the individual members of Parliament and MPPs have been very supportive of the need to support this Canada's largest and most vital transit system in an hour of great need caused by a health pandemic where we encouraged people to stay home, where in some cases we required them to stay home, where in some cases they were ill and had to stay home, and this of course dramatically reduced our revenues. Combined with the city's very significant commitment, what these other governments have done has allowed us to keep the transit system going, keep service at levels that are such to meet the needs that people have, and to do it safely. Any objective examination would say this has been a successful effort on the part of governments and the TTC working together, and that Torontonians can, as a result, ride the TTC comfortably and reliably and with confidence. A strong public transit system is vital to the economic engine that is Toronto. It's not just Ontario's economic engine, it is Canada's economic engine. And I'm committed, and I know the provincial and federal governments are, to making sure that we can build back better just as soon as we can. And on that note, I would now like to again welcome back the chair of the TTC, Councillor Jaye Robinson, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Mayor Tory, and thank you for your unwavering support. Prior to the pandemic, the TTC carried approximately 1.7 million customers each and every day. Over the course of the COVID pandemic, we have seen ridership fluctuate dramatically, falling as low as 15% of pre-pandemic ridership. Despite this unanticipated drop in revenue, the TTC has continued to provide reliable service for hundreds of thousands of people a day, including essential workers commuting to essential jobs across our city, Torontonians traveling to critical medical appointments, and people heading to the grocery store to pick up food and other necessary items. Even in the most challenging weeks of this pandemic, the TTC has continued to serve the riders who need and rely on us most. Going into 2021, the proposed budget ensures that we will continue to keep the City of Toronto moving through to the end of the pandemic and beyond. Since the onset of COVID, it has been very clear that the reduced ridership and additional safety measures would have a devastating impact on the TTC's budget. In light of these financial realities, the 2021 operating budget for the TTC was prepared, guided by 4 key priorities: to provide safe, seamless, and reliable transit service to the residents of Toronto, to transform how we do business, to solidify TTC as a financially sustainable, modern, and efficient system, to become a more inclusive and accessible organization, and of course to innovate for the future, to maintain a resilient system that encourages Torontonians to use transit, the mobility mode of choice. In order to achieve these objectives, the TTC staff are recommending a 2021 operating budget that totals $2.1 billion in gross expenditures and $500 million in revenues, requiring $1.5 billion in net funding to fully fund the 2021 operating budget. The TTC will also be seeking approval for its capital budget. The 2021 staff recommended capital budget is almost $1.3 billion, as the mayor mentioned earlier, including $902 million for infrastructure projects and $411 million for vehicle projects. Consistent with the 10-year capital plan, more than 60% of the capital budget is dedicated to critical state of good repair projects to maintain and improve our existing network, while the balance enables the TTC to continue important service improvement projects and purchase additional vehicles. This builds on the important work that began in 2020. For example, the fleet procurement strategy and plan, which we approved as a board, using the city's $1.1 billion in new funding to purchase additional streetcars, buses, and wheel-trans vehicles. Planning and early work on the Young Bloor capacity improvements, Line 1 and Line 2 capacity enhancements, and the ATC automatic train control capital projects. On the operating side, we are continuing to move forward with demand responsiveness planning. This planning ensures that the TTC is well positioned to respond to changing circumstances. And I have to say, as the chair of the TTC, this is one of the things I'm most proud of, is how the TTC is learning to pivot and move forward effectively. As I said in my very first interview back, there will be no fare increases for our riders this year. And I very much appreciate the mayor's support on this, as well as the TTC staff. This is great news for Toronto. We know that many of the people riding transit during the pandemic do not have the option of staying home. We recognize that buses have been the workhorses of our transit system over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are investing in service improvements. This budget balances the difficult fiscal realities with providing safe and reliable service to Torontonians who need it most. Thank you again to the mayor and to the mayor's office for your great work with the other orders of government. And I would like to conclude by thanking our CEO, Rick Leary, and our CFO, Josie Lavida, for their very hard work on this budget. Their innovative approach has resulted in the implementation of new modernization initiatives and the realization of significant cost savings. This will undoubtedly, without question, be our most difficult budget year in recent memory, or maybe forever. And with the help of the provincial and federal government, as the mayor has pointed out, we have assured Torontonians that they can rely on the TTC to get them where they need to go. Transit is the backbone of our city, and the TTC is going to play a critical role in the restart and recovery once we emerge on the other side of this horrific and tragic global pandemic. Keep safe, Toronto.
Thank you, Councillor Robinson and Mayor Tory. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, it's one question, one follow-up. We ask that you please unmute yourself before you speak. We also have Rick Leary, TTC CEO, on the line if you have any specific questions for him. First up, we have Nathan from CBC. Go ahead, Nathan.
Hi, thanks for taking my question, Mayor Tory, and sorry to switch gears a little bit here. The owner of a local sex shop says that she was told by Toronto Public Health that the items that she sells are essential, so things like condoms, other safe sex items, and was actually approved to stay open. Yet she says she was fined by bylaw officers for having indoor shopping. Why is she being told one thing from one branch of the city and the opposite from another?
Well, this shouldn't happen, and I will certainly look into this and make sure that we give consistent advice. And I'm not sure what that advice should be, because quite frankly, while I think it's important for things like condoms to be available to people, because this too prevents the spread of sexually transmitted diseases and allows for safe sex, I think it is fair for somebody like this to understand exactly which set of rules are applied to them. Condoms are available in other places like pharmacies and so on. So, but I'll have a look and see what is necessary in order to give this person the consistent single stream of advice that she deserves.
Follow up.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And another story that's in the news today is, you may have heard of it, a group of Cabbagetown residents who say they're fed up with issues like break-ins, thefts, and assaults that have been ongoing there. They've actually hired a security guard to patrol the area near Dundas and Shooter. What's your reaction to hearing this?
Well, I've talked to the police chief about this area of the town many times, and of course he and his men and women are doing their very best to police it. We are investing substantial sums of money and other resources in making sure that we do the things we need to do in order to keep the neighborhood stable. But you know, I will not back away from the fact that we have an obligation within any neighborhood in the city to both keep those neighborhoods safe and stable, but also to care for some of our most vulnerable people who sometimes, you know, will end up, you know, in a situation where they're out on the street, for example, where they're entitled to be. I mean, they're homeless people, they're not bad people, and they need our help and our support. So we have that dual obligation to fulfill as a city. We're doing that, and we're working closely with the local residents, and we'll try to make as much progress to keep their neighborhood in the way they would want it as possible, working with the police and with them.
Thank you, Nathan. Next up, we have Haley Cooper from News Talk 1010. Go ahead, Haley.
Thanks so much. Mayor Tory, regarding the cancellation of winter Camp TO programs and activities, this is going to be a big blow to working parents who are depending on those programs during the holiday break. So what are parents supposed to do now? And is the city effectively saying that these outdoor activities are not safe?
What the city is effectively saying in this and other areas, and maybe with more to come, for the reasons that I've outlined in terms of the very, very dire situation in which we find ourselves in terms of our healthcare system and the spread of COVID-19, is that the fewer opportunities people have to be outside of their home and to be together with one another, and that's how the virus spreads, the better. We want people to stay home. The actual registration at the time the programs were canceled was 300. And so while I'm not minimizing the impact that might have on a couple of hundred families, I also think that the vast majority of people in Toronto had not signed up for these programs, and therefore were planning to be at home with their family, as we're encouraging them to do over the course of Christmas. And so I'm sorry these programs aren't going to be happening, because kids enjoy them, and sometimes families rely upon them, but we just think it's in the best interest of public health for us not to have these programs this year. An extraordinary year, a sad year in many respects, but a year where we have the realities of a terrible pandemic to try to deal with.
Great, thank you for that. And we wanted to ask about reserving time on an ice rink. The process, and we walked through it in the newsroom today, it's awfully confusing and convoluted. A household needs to register and get a number, and then everyone inside that household needs to register and get a number. So is this solely because of the need to contact trace if any issue arises? Why can't people just make their reservation, show up, and sign in?
This falls under the category of no good deed goes unpunished. Our city staff did a magnificent job on days' notice of getting a registration system in place. They have subsequently improved it such that you can now book a date 7 days in advance, which I think is a big plus. But there's no doubt that if we have a bit more time, which we do, and we've got lots of winter left, we're just beginning. In fact, winter hasn't even officially arrived yet. We will make the system more user-friendly. But for the moment, the answer to your question is yes, in the interest of stopping the spread of COVID-19 and making sure we have thorough records of who is skating so that we can contact them in the event of any kind of a spread of the virus. The system is the way it is. But we're going to be working, and we are working to improve it, and I'm sure that we'll have some more to say about further improvements in the days to come.
Thanks, Haley. Next up, we have Ben Spur from the Toronto Star. Go ahead.
Hi there. This is for the mayor. The TTC is expected to have lower than normal ridership for years to come and will need some financial support. Instead of negotiating successive agreements with the province, have you had any discussions with Queen's Park about making provincial operating funding for the TTC permanent?
It's been raised before, but I will say to you that in the context of the discussions that are going on in kind of 2020 and looking forward to 2021, it has mainly constituted itself on extraordinary emergency funding in an extraordinary amount that has been needed in order to keep the TTC in financially acceptable shape and allow us to continue to provide the service that we're providing. So that has been, as you know, something that has been on the table since it was withdrawn, because there used to be operating support for the TTC from the province, and it will continue to be on the table because it is something that is right. It should be there, that support, and for that matter, there should be a federal contribution made in that regard as well, because I think we're one of the only countries in the Western world that doesn't have a degree of federal support for transit. But I'm very heartened by the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau has said there's permanent funding coming for transit across Canada next year in 2021, so we'll look forward to that.
And on another note, there was a Metrolinx report that came out today that seems to indicate the Ontario line won't open until about 2030, 3 years later than Premier Ford initially promised. One of the major selling points of the Ontario line was that it would be built faster than the Relief line, but it looks like that may not be the case. Is this just another instance of a government scrapping pre-existing plans and replacing them with their own projects, and in the process delaying the delivery of new transit for Toronto?
Well, I think the Ontario line, let's remember, will provide substantially enhanced service beyond what the relief line would have done. We were ready to go with the relief line, but we're now going to get a line that's going to serve more people in more places across the city, and that's a good thing. With respect to the timetable, I don't like to see any of these timetables slip, and I can tell you there are discussions that go on every day as to ways in which we can try and take any apparent lost time and make up for it. And I can assure you that's the case with the Ontario line. It certainly is the case as well with the Scarborough-Bloor-Danforth subway extension, because we want this transit built and in service as soon as possible, and I know the province is equally committed to that goal. So I will look at these things on a day-by-day basis, and while there'll be a report out one day saying it's going to be later, I'd like to think we can work together and find ways to get another report coming out later on that will say it can be finished sooner than that.
Thanks, Ben. Next up, we have Matt Bingley from Global. Go ahead, Matt.
Good afternoon, Mayor Tory. Yesterday, you were speaking about the additional lockdown measures being somewhat comparable to what we're seeing in Quebec with regards to the office workers. I'm just wondering, they are also restricting some of the big box stores to only sell the essential items. And you've been speaking about the fact that people are still going out much more than they should. Is that something that you'd like to advocate for Toronto, that the ones that are so far deemed essential services would be limited to selling only those essentials?
Well, first of all, I think that it is certainly appropriate that we should continue with the provisions we've had in place to allow for curbside pickup and delivery to be done by the smaller retailers, remembering that the message is for people to stay home as much as they possibly can. But I think that the inconsistency that we've seen with some of these bigger stores being open would certainly be something I wouldn't object to see brought into consistency. I just think what we have to do is put in place a regime, whether it's through capacity restriction overall or whether it is through closing some of the stores that have remained open. We need to provide fewer places for people to go, recognizing they have some real necessities. The real necessities you have in life are provided for with medicine, with food, and a very few other things. And I think that what we really want to get across is this message that says it is those bare necessities, those absolute necessities that people should be out getting, and that beyond that, we're inviting them and asking them and encouraging them to stay home. So whatever regime we come up with, in consultation with medical officers of health and on their advice and with the province, I think will be a step forward in terms of, getting to the day when this won't be the kind of terrible nightmare that it is for so many people, including business.
Your bare necessities comment's going to have me singing Jungle Book songs later on today. I just wanted to follow up on your Cabbagetown comment. My colleague is working on this story as well, and I'm just wondering, do you think it's a good practice to have neighbors paying for their own private security? Do you have any concerns about the issues that could come out of people they have patrolling neighborhoods and deeming people are not worthy of being in those areas?
I think it is an area, so let me start that again. I think it is an area that should be approached with great care. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, the notion that we should have security guards out patrolling private property is something that is not an innovation. I mean, there are security guards all over town that are patrolling and watching over private property. But I think that it is really the question of what the role of those people is, how they interact with the public, that has to be watched very carefully, because we have a police service. They're excellent at what they do. They patrol this area and every other area of the city. They can't be everywhere all the time, but they're certainly very diligent about going about their duties, and they're given special responsibilities and special accountabilities in carrying out that work. And we can't have those people replaced by, or even contemplated to be replaced by, private security guards. So I just think it's something to be approached with great care, but the principle of having security guards that are watching over things in the city is something that we long ago accepted, but within limits.
Thanks, Matt. Next up, we have Nick from CBC. Go ahead, Nick.
Hi, thanks. A question for Mayor Tory and Councillor Robinson as well. So since the DTC is expecting to essentially maintain similar service levels next year, you're not freezing fares, but there's no real certainty that you're going to have funding into the next fiscal year. So do you think people in the city should expect that things will go smoothly and go as planned, or is there still a risk that this could all get changed if some of that funding doesn't come through?
I think I will answer and ask Councillor Robinson if she wants to comment as well. I think we should be a lot more optimistic than the question suggested, because included in some of the arrangements that have been made by Transportation Minister Caroline Mulroney is some money that will in fact flow in their fiscal year that we're currently in, but will go into our new year. And so a part of the problem, a significant part of the problem that we would face with a declining or a lower ridership in 2021, in fact, we know we'll get some assistance with that from the two governments, federal and provincial, based on our discussions with the provincial government. So it does leave a hole, a gap of some money, which is a lot less than we started out with. And so we will find a way to make sure what we're not going to do is we're not going to penalize the people who need the TTC to get to work. And so we're just going to have to find a way to make all these ends meet. But we've had substantial help already from the other two governments for 2021.
Thank you, Mayor Tory. And I would just add that I feel very hopeful. It's just been a lot of good news of recent, and I think our staff have done an excellent job tackling this. You know, at one point I would call a stark budget, a very stark fiscal position. So I'm very hopeful, and what I'm again really excited to see is the TTC is really learning to adapt and shift and pivot where necessary. So if that means we need more buses in one neighborhood in Toronto because numbers have gone up, we are reacting to that. I can't say that was happening years ago. So this is something I'm very excited about, is to see this adaptability, flexibility, and this new way of thinking at the TTC, largely led by our CEO. But it's very exciting. And at the same time, we're facing dire issues, and it will take, I think the recovery period will be quite lengthy, because as we know, people may be less enthused about being in settings as we go through the next 6 to 8 months, in settings where there's a large gathering of people. So we saw that even with SARS. So I think it's very important we stay tuned, we watch our numbers, which we're really using data and research like never before. And I'm feeling very hopeful about this.
Can I just add one thing that was implied, if not directly spoken to, by Councillor Robinson's comments, which is that, you know, we understand we have an obligation as well to continue to build up confidence in the TTC, not so much with regard to its service reliability, which is actually very excellent and has continued to be excellent during the pandemic, but with regard to the, I'll call it the health and safety aspects of riding on the TTC. And the fact is that during the pandemic, riding on the TTC has been very safe based on the objective evidence and based on the policies in place, including the compulsory use of masks. But I just came off a meeting just right before this with the major employers from across the city, and they, you know, we're going to be working together with them to increase confidence in public transit and the fact that it is safe, and we will continue to keep it safe. And that is why the flexibility that Councillor Robinson made reference to be able to shift resources back and forth through the system is going to be so important to us as we go forward, and as ridership does increase over the course of the year, though it probably won't get back to normal levels, you know, this year, just because it's going to take some time for that to happen.
And if I could follow up on Ben's question from earlier, but maybe put it to Rick Leary. The forecast that's in the budget report laying out the possibility that ridership isn't normal until as late as 2023. So that prospect of maybe a different kind of funding model, one that promises a more sort of permanent structure, what do you think that would mean to help the TTC plan ahead and adjust over the next few years?
Go ahead, Rick. You'll just need to unmute yourself. Perfect.
Hi, thank you very much for that question. You know, in line with what the chair and the mayor were talking about, is we will continue the dialogue and discussions with the other levels of government to address just that. As you're well aware, the TTC has had discussions for many years now about being so dependent on the fare box, in the 67% range on the fare box. When the pandemic occurs like this, it really does put that extra strain on the organization and the city, as well as the other levels of government, for funding. So that, what you bring up, is exactly what we intend to have and follow up with discussions on.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have David Ryder from Toronto Star. Go ahead, David.
Hi, Mayor. We're not going to hear from Dr. Davila today, but we had record high case counts yesterday. I'm wondering, I know you get briefed every day, do we have another day of very high case counts? And are you any closer at all to telling us what the new lockdown is going to look like? Or when do you expect that?
Well, it's not going to be up to me, I don't think. I think it's best if these measures are done regionally, and therefore it implies that the province would be the best place to have those new recommendations come from. And as I said yesterday, we have been in discussions around the region, and we've been in discussions with the province, and the medical officers of health have all been talking to one another to try and come up with something that will, make a genuine contribution to the well-being of people and to the improvement in these numbers. And so, I've been very careful not to go through kind of an item-by-item list of what's going to be in our view in that package, because we know what we think, but we've been sharing that information with others, and it's a team effort here. So I guess I just have to say stay tuned, because I would expect within the context of giving proper advance notice that we'll have some word on what is likely to transpire in the next couple of days.
Okay, and follow-up question on another subject. The other day, Councillor Mark Grimes raised eyebrows by tweeting at Kamala Harris and basically telling her to stop talking, and then a follow-up tweet to a resident of Toronto, about something about sheep. You endorsed Councillor Grimes and you did a robocall for him. Have you talked to him about that, or do you understand what was going on when he was a Toronto City Councillor was tweeting at the Vice President-elect?
Well, I will say that Councillor Grimes is a very diligent councillor who speaks up for and represents the interests of his residents each and every day, and I'm personally witness to that, and he does a great job for us as chair of Exhibition Place as well. But he's aware of the fact that I think, frankly, most politicians are much better off if they stay off these social media platforms within the context of expressing views about anything that's going on, kind of editorial views, as opposed to doing what I do with social media, which is usually just to keep people informed of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and different announcements and policies that we're putting forward. And I think this is another good reason that people should adopt that approach. And people make their own decisions about this. I'm not accountable for what councillors do or any other elected officials on social media platforms, but I know what I do. I know why I think it's right. I think it avoids a lot of this kind of polarized discussion that is not healthy for the political process, and I think Councillor Grimes is well aware of my thoughts on this.
Thanks, David. And last, we have Christina from CP24. Go ahead, Christina.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. Mayor Tory, you've commented a bit on these two questions I'm going to ask, but I wanted to follow up on the potential for a further lockdown or a regional lockdown. I know you don't want to give out specifics, but I know that you have been trying to determine, you've been in discussions about tightening Toronto's current lockdown. I guess what I'm wondering is, and I somewhat asked this yesterday, I mean, how much further can we go here when we take a look at the province's framework? The lockdown is the highest level of restrictions in the province's framework, unless they expand that framework. Can you give us some insight?
Well, a fair bit of the discussion that we are having would involve the province expanding the scope of the framework, and I've suggested, and I believe it's so, that it is a good time of the year that you could, there's no good time to do this, but it's a better time of year to consider that, given the numbers, but also given the fact that it's a quieter time of year. So if you were to look, for example, at taking a pause on kids coming back to school and having some virtual learning for the first part of January, knowing that's not an entirely simple proposition, and knowing that the schools have not been a hotbed of outbreak. We've done very well in the hundreds and hundreds of schools in Toronto, but if the objective is to keep people home and have them stay home more often, including kids and adults, then you would look at that. You would look, as I said yesterday, at the kind of measure that has been brought in Quebec, where you're saying to people in office space, please stay home and work from home, and that you might be more forceful in saying to people that that is something that we really think is necessary while we have this period where we're trying to battle these numbers to the ground. And so I think that those are the kinds of things that I assume might be considered by the province, and we're just trying to give the best advice that we can and work cooperatively with them and work cooperatively with the other people in the region, because I'm also very much of the view that this should be a regional consideration, not just the City of Toronto, because people move back and forth and around too much to not have it be regional. But the principal advice is the same as it's been for a long, long time. Please stay home. If everybody did that, except for once a week going shopping and absolute necessity going out to work if you had to, then I think we'd be a long way to achieving the objective we have here, which is to fight this virus.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to follow up as well about the GoFundMe in Cabbagetown. On the issue of needles in public places being littered and drug paraphernalia. There are a couple spots in the city where this is an ongoing problem, including, according to the residents of the Cabbagetown area, their community. Do you think if this is something 311 made more of a priority in terms of cleanup of these things, a community like Cabbagetown could avoid hiring their own private security guard? I mean, you contact 311 and there are things, of course, on their list of emergencies or priority, and my understanding is something like a needle cleanup is not high on that list. And frankly, I speak from experience. I've called myself. It does take about 24 to 48 hours for something like a needle cleanup. And again, I point this out recognizing, it may not be considered an emergency. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think the existence of needles on the street or in close proximity where you might have kids or adults or even pets is a problem. And we have in other parts of the city, especially in some of the parts of downtown, made arrangements for extra cleanup shifts to happen with our city workers. And I'm prepared to undertake right now to take a look. I have met with the Cabbagetown residents and heard some of these concerns. Within the context of the caution that I expressed earlier on about people employing private security guards, depending on what it is they're doing, I certainly think that city workers, we could take a look at whether we could do an extra cleanup in there, for example, or increase the frequency of cleanups, because the needles are something that are of real concern. Not to say all the rest of it isn't as well, but that's a real concern. And so I will undertake to do that.
That's it for today. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.